Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the session on scaling geospatial vector data. And without any further ado, let's get started.
All right. So I'm Julie Signell. I had sort of started the second version of dask-geopandas, which is a lot of what we're going to be talking about here today, based off the former version of dask-geopandas, which Matt Rockland started, and GeoPandas, which a lot of the GeoPandas people are on this call now. So this conversation is really going to be about geospatial vector analysis, and it's really talking about early stage code that is not super user facing yet. So this isn't really like going to be a tutorial or like how to use the dask-geopandas, but more of a conversation about what the conceptual approach for implementing this tool should be. And so the point is really to like discuss different approaches and figure out how to move the project forward. So we're going to have 6 different talks. They're each going to be 5 minutes long from different projects, and then we're also going to hear about different use cases that aren't using dask-geopandas yet, but might be a good motivation for the future of the project. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Joris for the first presentation, which is a demo of dask-geopandas. And Joris, you can introduce yourself. Joris, are you ready to do your Oh, Joris says he can't hear anything. Can other people hear?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
I can hear you.
I guess we should type that.
Okay, so I will maybe do my talk. I only can't hear anything. So if you want to communicate with me, you need to chat and I can fix it afterwards. Okay. Let me share my screen. So you should see my notebook now. But first, my name is Joris van den Bossche. I'm one of the GeoPandas maintainers working for Apache Arrow at the moment at Ursa Computing. For this workshop, I'm going to start with giving a very short, brief demo of the Dask GeoPandas package that how it currently exists. So it's a very early stage project to integrate GeoPandas and Dask based on a prototype that Matthew Rocklin did a while ago and then last year picked up by Julia and me. I assume that most people here are somewhat familiar with either Dask or GeoPandas, but just to set the stage, so Dask, among other things, can scale a pandas data frame, while GeoPandas extends a data frame with geospatial functionality. So what we want to do in this package is exactly the combination of both. Scaling GeoPandas geodata frame, or put the other way around, extending the Dask data frame with geospatial functionality, just as GeoPandas does that with pandas. I'm going to, for the demo here, reading in a relatively small data set, a little bit of pre-processing, you don't need to check that. But so it's a natural Earth data set with provinces and districts of the full world. So this is a GeoPandas geodata frame right now. I read it with GeoPandas here. And we can convert that to a dask-geopandas geodata frame. If we do from GeoPandas, so of course this is a small data set just in memory, but specifying we want 4 partitions. So this will actually create a dask-geopandas geodata frame. So compared to the things you know, so it's a subclass of a Dask data frame. But so Dask data frame consists of many pandas data frames under the hood. The partitions here, the partitions are not pandas data frames, but GeoPandas geodata frames. And just as we had in GeoPandas, we added the same spatial methods and attributes to this subclass. So a few small examples. We can, this is a non-spatial example, but so just as with GeoPandas, you can access any non-spatial column. And for example, in this case, I count the number of values in the number of entries in our data sets for each country. This is the 3 character code for countries. So Great Britain has many entries in the data set. But of course, the more interesting part for this workshop is the fact that we can also have a .geometry attribute, giving us the geometries and geoseries. For example, we can get centroids. This is all just as with the Dask data frame are lazy operations, building up the task graph. Or so you can see that it knows that the centroid will return new geometries, so a geoseries, while the area of our geometry will return a float series. So we can then actually, for example, calculate that by calling compute. So very basic demonstration. If you're familiar with either GeoPandas or with Dask, it will should come naturally. Of course, the goal is that we can leverage the capabilities of Dask. So for that, to just show that it does work, I made our data set a little bit bigger to see some difference, to see some effects. So 50 times larger. And now I do a small calculation. So what I'm doing here is for all my polygons, I take the intersection with an area around my hometown, calculating the area of those intersections, taking some of it. So you can see that this is using, this is using the normal GeoPandas data frame, while this is using the Dask GeoPandas geodata frame. It's around 3 times faster, a bit faster. My laptop has 4 cores, so that's a decent speed up. And it's actually thanks to the fact that I'm using PyGeos package under the hood. So it's in the transition to become Shapely, the next version of Shapely. But so it's a rewrite of Shapely basically, and that releases the GIL, which makes that it's that I can make use of multi-threading here to parallelize those geospatial calculations. Of course, what I did here, taking the intersection of my full data frame, my full partitioned data frame with a single buffer, I'm doing a lot of wasteful calculations. If I would know the spatial extents of my my data frame, of the partitions. And that's of course where the more interesting parts of this work comes from is making use of such information, such spatial partitioning. It's something we will several of the talks further in the workshop will come back to this. There is currently in the package dask-geopandas a very basic dummy implementation of spatial partitioning. And how does it work for now? So our geodata frame, our Dask, our partitioned geodata frame has partitions, and we store the spatial extent of each partition as a polygon, as another geometry. And so normally we'll ensure that you have those spatial partitions available, but just for the demo, there is a method calculate those partitions and ignore the warnings. But now there is an attribute spatial partitions available. And so what is this? Maybe what's useful to see. So we have 4 partitions in our Dask data frame, and this gives a length for geoseries, a normal GeoPandas geoseries. So basically, for each of the partitions in our partition data frame, we have 1 polygon that represents the spatial extent of this partition. We can quickly plot that to get an idea of how those are looking. Of course, this data is just randomly distributed over the globe, so those partitions are overlapping a lot, so they are not very useful at all. So there is where all the smartness can come in to ensure that we can repartition our data, or that we can partition them either by some sorting algorithm that will come in the next talk, or with known areas and things like that. So, but the basics are there. A lot of things to extend. Just to show that there is already a bit of integration, specifically with the Parquet file format. So I can write my data frame, my partition data frame to Parquet, and if I read it back again, so again a dask-geopandas data frame, my spatial partitions were preserved in the round trip. We can make use of the spatial partitions in a lot of operations, but currently it's integrated in the CX indexer, with which you can create a subset of your data based on coordinates slicing. So for example, here, slicing with coordinates, so from x min, x max, y min, y max, it is a part of Canada and Greenland. And if I visualize the graph of this, you can see that it actually, based on the spatial partitioning information, it will know that it only needs to read from 2 of my 4 partitions, my Parquet files. So when I wrote the Parquet to Parquet, I created the partitioned Parquet dataset. And based on this spatial partitioning, it knows now when further working with the subset, I only need to read in those partitions. So that's one small example of how the spatial partitioning information is already being used. But so a lot of room to improve there. So you can see if I computed and plotted it, indeed, that's Greenland and Canada. Just to mention, but only a small demo using all in-memory data, but of course, just as with Dask data frames, you can also do this out of memory on your laptop, distributed, etc. Of course, for those cases, the efficient file format is quite important, and so Parquet is one that is integrated. here's some, I just linked some demos that I would like to update or rerun with the latest state of Dask GeoPandas, but I didn't get to that in time for this talk. So to summarize my parts, I think since you're all here, you probably are interested in this, but so very welcome to experiment with it, reports things. We will also discuss a lot of things this workshop that we can take along to work on. The basics are there. There is a geodata frame structure. Many of the element-wise methods are available. Very basic spatial partitioning. There is some I/O for but so many more things are still coming. We plan to further work on it, but also needed to make it actually useful. So a lot of things related to spatial partitioning that will be highlighted later in the workshop. But there are also some more methods from GeoPandas that can be ported to Dask GeoPandas to have a Dask version of them. Better integration with more I/O or visualization tools, etc. Okay, so that's it for now. So it's my short introduction to the Dask GeoPandas package. And now I'm looking where I can stop sharing my screen. Wow.
All right, thanks, Joris. Hopefully you can solve your audio now. All right, so the next talk will be about spatial pandas from Jon Mease. So Jon Mease, yeah, great. You can introduce yourself.
Oh, sorry, this is my screen. Okay, can you hear me? Can you see my screen?
Sounds good. Yep,
great.
I see it.
Okay, so just for context, this is work that I started almost 2 years ago now, working with Jim and the PyViz team. I'm not really directly involved in this at the moment, but was happy to come around and talk through what we did back then and see if anything is useful for adoption or borrowing or stealing by GeoPandas. Okay, so this project called Spatial Pandas. So the whole reason this started was coming out of some needs from the Datashader project. So Datashader is this Python library, uses Numba that is optimized for performing rasterization of large data sets. That's designed to use Dask to parallelize rasterizing points and lines to build visualizations from these rasterizations. And we wanted to be able to do this with geometric data for things like the kinds of GeoJSON-like shapes that GeoPandas supports. But it wasn't really an option to have Datashader run directly on GeoPandas as representation. That's because Datashader is designed to work on top of data frames, and basically it uses Numba to traverse these vectorized arrays of contiguous memory in the data frames, and then from that write into a buffer to do like the rasterization part. So with GeoPandas holding on to arrays of Shapely objects, or even now holding on to references to the PyGeos arrays, that wasn't really a good fit for the way Datashader worked. So the initial idea was just wanting to have a contiguous buffer memory representation of geometry columns that Datashader could use to render from. And so that was the first piece. The first piece was I wrote some extension arrays for pandas based on PyArrow, like ragged list arrays in PyArrow. So for things like polygons, you get 2 or 3 levels of nesting in these contiguous arrays to represent the polygon for each row, and then multiple polygons and holes for each one. And the Datashader had the logic in it then to traverse these and look at the indices, the pi arrow stored, and figure out that they were polygons and rasterize them to the buffer. So that was the first goal, to have a contiguous memory representation of the geometric data types. The second goal then was the Datashader was already set up to use Dask for parallelization, and we had an earlier kind of prototype version of something that was designed to do spatial indexing, where the idea was if you're zoomed way in on one part of the world and you're operating on a Dask data frame, it'd be great if you could only load in the partitions that are potentially overlapping with that part of the world and not actually process all the partitions in the data frame. And so we wanted to bring that support also to this spatial pandas library to have a way to parallelize the calculations and to do spatial indexing. So what I ended up doing for this was basing the spatial indexing on something called a Hilbert R tree. So I'll talk about that a little bit later. I'm not going to go too far into what R trees are, but I hope I can at least have some cartoons to talk about roughly what's happening. But the library itself has a NumPy implementation of the Hilbert curve calculations and the R tree packing. And then basically I did something just like what dask-geopandas did, where there are, where it uses a Dask data frame subclass and then maintains spatial indexing information on the partitions. So really that structure is almost exactly the same, but then this is how it actually does the spatial packing. So quickly, a Hilbert curve it's a family of what are called space filling curves. So the idea of a space filling curve is to have some way of mapping a two or multi-dimensional point into a one-dimensional distance. So for the Hilbert curve in particular, the way I like to think about it is if you take a square, and then discretize it into a grid. So you can choose kind of whatever resolution of a grid you want for that square. The Hilbert curve gives you a way to kind of traverse through all of the points in that grid in a linear fashion and make sure you hit all of them. So as the resolution increases, you can get these more and more dense curvy things, but if you follow the curve all the way through, you'll hit every point and then get to the end. So what that means is every grid point in the square, you can assign it a linear distance. You can give it a scalar distance. So you can go from a two-dimensional point in space to a scalar distance. And the property that's useful about the Hilbert curve is that if 2 points have a distance that's close together, then they'll also be close together in the two-dimensional space. So you kind of get this mapping of if they're close together in one dimensions, they're also somewhat close together in two dimensions. And then that's useful for building an R tree. So R tree are these recursive data structures that keep track of bounding boxes of their partitions to make it faster to traverse. There's lots of details and different algorithms for building them and algorithms for traversing them that I won't go into. But the rough idea here of what Spatial Pandas does is the first thing you do is you create a fine grid across all your shapes, across the space that all your shapes live in. Then basically map the centroid of each of your shapes to the nearest grid point in that Hilbert curve space. And that lets you compute a Hilbert curve distance for every shape in your collection. Then sort everything by that Hilbert curve distance. And then basically use that sorted data to partition it into bins and use those partitions, bounding boxes around those partitions to build up your R tree. The idea is the Hilbert curve sorting should make sure that your bounding boxes don't overlap too much. And it's not a guaranteed thing, but it overall does a pretty good job of making sure your partitions are relatively separated. And this whole thing is a really nice fit for Dask. The algorithm really maps nicely to a Dask data frame. You can use like a single vectorized operation to compute the Hilbert curve distance for every row in your data frame. If you call a set index on that Hilbert curve distance column, you basically get the effect of both sorting it and partitioning it into these equal sized bins. So that's really the two kind of most intensive part of the calculation are doing this partitioning and sorting, and Dask's set index does them together. And then from there, you can go through with all your partitions and compute the bounding boxes of whatever ended up in those partitions and use that to build up an R tree. And spatialpandas has its custom number implementation R tree, but this could be the same, the regular spatial index libraries R tree that GeoPandas already uses. That would be fine. And with this, okay, go ahead.
GeoPandas using Dask.
Is there a question or? No, I think that was an accidental unmuting.
Okay, sure. So this last point, then we can if there are any questions. So once you've done this spatial sorting and computed this R tree, then it is very efficient to calculate which partitions from your Dask data frame potentially overlap with a test point. So things like the spatial index CX operator can use it. Things like spatial joining can use it. And I think it's a pretty nice approach to be able to kind of fit a spatial indexing paradigm into the kind of one-dimensional partitioned paradigm that Dask data frames already use. And that's what I have.
Thank you, Jon Mease. That's really helpful, and it'll set up the conversation for later about different mechanisms for spatial partitioning. So next, we're going to hear from Jim Bednar about Datashader. So I'll let you introduce yourself and take it from there.
Hello, I'm Jim Bednar. I work at Anaconda and worked with Jon and Julia and several other people on this call at various points, Joris even long ago. And at Anaconda, we make general purpose tools to help the Python ecosystem. And so we're not specifically a geosciences group, but a lot of our collaborators are geoscientists. And so we try to make sure to cover geoscience use cases while only preparing and presenting general purpose tools. And so that has some implications. Datashader has already been mentioned. If you want to learn more, to go to datashader.org. If you want to know about how it intersects with, well, first off, Datashader turns whatever you've got, whatever it handles, it turns it into a fixed raster. And so a fixed raster happens to be something you put on your screen. You could use it for other things, which we'll get to. But basically, you've got points, you've got polygons, you've got meshes, whatever they are, Datashader will turn it into a raster very quickly using Dask if you've got it. And so if you go to datashader.org and go to the user guide, there's a handy thing under the very last section, performance. That's how you'll see how it intersects with Dask and with spatialpandas and all these other projects. Basically, Datashader will handle point data, line data, areas, triangular meshes, things that are already rasters and re-rasterize them, quad meshes and polygons. Those are the things it can do. And it'll handle it for various types of data structures, pandas data structures, Dask built on pandas, CUDA GPU data frames, and so on, Dask spatial pandas, as Jon just pointed out, X-array objects. And so for every one of these things that it supports, there's actually a Dask. Dask is supported for every one of them in some combination, but then there are various combinations that are not currently supported. And we added spatial pandas because we had a missing hole over here. We had nothing that could render polygons because they didn't fit nicely into pandas. And even though they did fit into GeoPandas, as Jon mentioned, they didn't fit in a way that Datashader could make use of because we needed a big contiguous block. And Joris has been doing great work changing that assumption and really working on GeoPandas to make it work better in ways that we could make use of in Datashader. But right now we still can't make use of it until it completely doesn't depend on the geostack, because our tool can't depend on that. So for the moment we're using spatial pandas. We'd love to just not have any role in maintaining spatial pandas. That's not our thing. But for the moment, that's what we do. So here's an example of a Datashader app. This is using Datashader to take a very large 50 million point database of ship locations, bin each ship location by pixel, color by the type of that ship, and then when you zoom in, you'll see that it's rasterized. We're going to wait for Datashader to process it here. This app is sleepy. It's having to page things into memory. And now you'll see it re-rasterized to the screen. You can see all these trajectories. If you keep zooming in again, you'll see that it's re-rasterizing everything. This is all based on Datashader and spatial pandas. And where spatial pandas really comes into play is if I do a click here in this plot. Now these are just pixels on my screen, but if I wanted to select this point right here, which I just did, and I hit that, and there are a couple of ships, and it looked up those ships and found that particular one. The way it did that is by going back to the original data set, doing a spatial query on that small location using spatial pandas to give me all the points that are in this little spot. And so I'm able to take a large rasterized data set and select using all the spatial partitioning stuff that Jon just showed fairly efficiently, although I think there's still lots of room for improvement in the efficiency, so that I can work with million-point data sets. The data never goes into my browser, but I can interactively click on things and explore things about the underlying data set, going back to it with all the spatial tools of spatial pandas. And just a very quick demo, there's the same thing. That was point data. This is polygon data. If I zoom into the polygon data, you'll see that it's rasterizing again and again. The same thing. If I hover over it, it's again doing a spatial query, finding that polygon, and then overlaying the vector version of that polygon. That's what, as you see me hover here, that's what's happening. It's going back to the original data set, doing a spatial query, pulling that out as a GeoPandas type of Shapely object, overlaying that. And so I can work with very large data set. This is all the building shapes in New York. And so I can render them all, update that rendering as I zoom in, and then do interactive selections, all of which doesn't depend on any geo tools, actually. Nothing specific. And same for triangular meshes and such. If you want to learn more, you go to datashader.org, but also I recommend just going to hvplot.holobis.org. That's the easiest way, because if you do an hvplot, it's the same. You can do this with a GeoPandas data set. I don't know what happens, but certainly you can do it with pandas, and then you just do datashader equals true or rasterize equals true. So hvplot is a super convenient way to use Datashader. And last point is that spatial pandas spun out of Datashader. Another project called X-Array Spatial also spun out. And X-Array Spatial is, once you've rasterized something with Datashader and you've got this nice raster representation, there are all sorts of algorithms you could run on it that you weren't able to run on the original vector version of it, the polygons. And so you can do zonal statistics, you can do various hill shading, calculating DBI, all sorts of things you can do on the rasterized version that you couldn't do on the original version. So X-Array Spatial and Datashader forms a nice part of a pipeline. As you start with polygon vector data, use Datashader to rasterize it, use X-Ray Spatial to run various raster-based spatial analyses, and then you can go take that away. So to get started, go to examples.pybez.org and find any of the examples I showed here, like the ship traffic one or the polygons, etc. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Jim. We do have a quick question, which is just if you try to use hollow views or geoviews on Dask Geo data frames, does that work, and does Datashader work? My understanding is that it would work, but it would bring all the data into memory.
It would work, and it would not bring it. Basically, hollow views is built on a big stack of every library in the universe, and to the extent that it understands how to work with that data, it will leave the data in its current format. So if you use hollow views on a Dask data frame and you call Datashader equals true on that object, as long as every step in that pathway is supported, it should stay Dask. It should be rendered using Dask, and it'll be displayed. So basically the answer is yes, it is supported. All the combinations that I showed you here, if you start with one of these data structures and it's supported by hollow views, which I believe they all are, and you tell HoloViews to render something with Datashader, it should keep it in whatever this format is, whether that's a QDF GPU, it should stay on the GPU all the way through.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you. All right, next we're going to hear a few use cases. So we're going to start with Stefanie Lumnitz, who's going to be talking about biomass estimation.
Okay, awesome. I'm going to share my screen. Can you hear me all right? Okay, awesome.
Yep.
Cool. So thanks for the invitation. I'm Stefanie. I'm a PyCell core developer, and I also work for the European Space Agency, where I look at spatial patterns of forest structure from space, together in collaboration with colleagues from NASA. So first of all, what is forest structure and why are we actually interested in it? We're talking in terms of forest structure. We're currently very interested in basically the distribution of trees and the distribution of their canopies in three-dimensional space, because these indicators, so forest structure is an indicator of, for example, how much carbon is stored in forests globally. It's an indicator of habitat availability for different mammal and bird species. It's also an indicator of how biodiverse forests can be, and gives information about if an ecosystem is functioning well and which impacts of climate change we could expect in future, depending on how forest structure changes over time. So we're currently investigating how to calculate different forest structure metrics from NASA's Global Ecosystem Dynamics Investigation, or GEDI. GEDI is an instrument that is mounted on the ISS. And is a full waveform, it is generating full waveform LiDAR data. And that means you can see here on the left, we have or LiDAR shots. We basically send in direction Earth, and then we get a reflectivity profile back, which more or less indicates how the vertical structure of this shot on Earth looks like. So we more or less get a point every 60 meters with such a waveform, as you can see here on the left, that is a proxy for how forest structure looks like globally. So we are currently curious about assessing these spatial signatures of vertical forest structure in the tropics specifically. So here you can see an example of different types of waveforms on the right, and how they are spatially distributed on the left. So for example, if you look on the right side, we have on the upper right corner more a savanna type land cover, where we have a basically large signal reflectivity from the ground, and there's not so much above the ground. If we look at the right bottom corner, for example, we can see that we have loads of reflectivity from the canopy top with potentially very high trees. And currently it is not clear yet globally how these different types of forest structure are actually spatially distributed, which we can now investigate with something like GEDI. So the challenge we're of course facing here as well is we have these millions or billions of GEDI shots, which are waveform returns, and we want to first of all transform these shots into latent space representations for us to then cluster these representations vertically and see if we have, if we can identify different classes of forest structure, so to say. And then in the next step, we would like to analyze the global spatial distribution of these waveform classes. So we currently really have a need for efficient spatial indexing of these millions of GEDI shots we get as a latitude and longitude shot information, so point geometries basically. We're also interested in fast geometry creation, because if we're just wanting to look at forest structure in the tropics, for example, we need a way of clipping these points to a specific spatial extent. And we're also interested in building spatial weights or generating information about spatial lag to, for example, then also analyze neighborhood relations between these different types of waveform classes. So this is all very new, and we've just started doing this type of analysis, and we think that all these tools that have been presented so far do potentially offer solutions for us to just do a type of analysis like this a lot faster and make it possible. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. It's good to hear like different ways that we can go. All right, the next use case. Martin, did you want to address this question right now about how spatial lag is computed?
Yeah, we can do it now or later. I think now is fine.
Yeah.
Whatever.
So yeah, the question, Stefanie, is can you explain more about how spatial lag is computed?
So currently we are at the beginning of classifying this, so we haven't thought about in depth how we want to compute the spatial lag. Like ideally, I personally would like to just leverage tools that are already out there, for example, in using PyCell for computing spatial lag, but not sure I can answer this question.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so we'll move on to the next use case, which is Anita Graser talking about movement data. It looks like you're unmuted, but I cannot hear you.
Okay, now I have the right microphone.
Okay, great. Yeah, much better.
Thanks so much.
Yeah.
So my name is Anita Graser. I work with the Austrian Institute of Technology, and I do movement research. And that's what motivated me to start building a library that makes it more convenient to work with movement data. And we already saw an example of a ship movement data in the Datashader presentation. So I've been working with quite similar data sets as well. And for moving pandas in particular, the design currently is in a way that I'm modeling each moving object or the trajectory of each moving object as a trajectory object, and that has a geodata frame to store the information about the geographic and temporal information. And Moving Pandas itself aims to make it easier to explore this data and to analyze it as well. And so far, most of the focus was really on making it easy to use and convenient, straightforward to get all kinds of interactive visualizations, also with HVplot, and much less on the performance. So you will find that there's a lot of possibilities for enhancement still. But basically, the minimum example is you just have a couple of points and timestamps, and you create a geodata frame, and you put the geodata frame into a moving pandas trajectory object, which you can then plot and analyze. For example, calculate the lengths, obviously, but also the movement speeds, and you can aggregate the trajectories of multiple moving objects, like here, for example, different birds migrating from Northern Europe to Africa and back. And it has all those convenience functions, which make all the steps really easy to do. So I also have examples, obviously, from ship data. So A lot of the analyses that are of interest besides just visualizing stuff are, for example, a simplification of the trajectories that could be either purely geometric, but it could also be spatial temporal generalization algorithms. Then there's also, of course, the interest in doing analysis like stop detections, like for the grounding of this cargo ship in the Suez Canals a couple of weeks in the past. I created this small demo where I applied a rather simple stop detection algorithm and then had a look into how we can explore these distribution of the stops over time and in space to find out interesting insights about how the situation developed. So there's already quite a bit of overlap, and I think that would be rather easy to parallelize because you can look at each trajectory on its own. But obviously, if you have other more interesting patterns, you would have to look at pairs of trajectories. So there it would help if probably the trajectories which are close in space and in time would be in the same partition, so you could compare them easily. Sometimes you would also be looking potentially for patterns with more than just two moving objects. For example, in movement ecology, you want to discover if there's any flocking patterns, so multiple movers joining into a group, traveling together for a while and then dispersing again. All these kinds of patterns would be of interest. So I guess what this use case really adds to the table is that we're not just looking for spatial, but also for spatial temporal patterns. That makes it a bit more challenging. I've also had a few people ask now, how's the 3D support? And that's something I'm not sure was mentioned now in the spatial pandas discussion, whether that's does 3D analysis. That I would be interested in knowing that as well. And I had some dabble with HVplot and Datashader as well. However, I found that with the GeoPandas and Datashader integration, I couldn't achieve the same performance as if I just accessed the regular data frames with XY columns. So all the examples that I've been working through here with Datashader for a couple million points, they are all based not on GeoPandas, unfortunately, but just regular pandas data frames. So if there's been any development, I would be interested in hearing that. I certainly really enjoyed that you can also plot the lines with Datashader. That helped me a lot. I don't know why it's not updating right now, but I can confirm that it does work indeed. Okay, so with this, I'd like to give back to you.
Yeah, great, thank you. It's good to remember about the temporal dimension as well. Okay, so the next use case is from Dani Arribas-Bel. It's about areal interpolation.
Yep, let me. Cool, can you see my screen?
Yep, looks good.
Super, so this is way less organized than the previous two talks, but hopefully will be enough to give you a few, to give you a sense of why we're using, or why we would love to see more of that GeoPandas from the set of use cases that I'm representing. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about is as part of the PySol community, which is a library for space analytics in Python, is very much built on the vector paradigm. So we work with points, lines, and polygons, and particularly polygons and points, although we do have things for lines. And I suppose it was really interesting seeing the spatial pandas talk before, because we have different use cases. So a lot of what we do is with vectors, and it doesn't always work to convert those vectors to raster first to then do whatever analysis we want. So hopefully I'll give you an example of that, and I think maybe that will help you understand why dask-geopandas would be great for us. So PySol is now really an ecosystem. It's more of an umbrella package or a meta package of a lot of smaller packages that help you explore the spatial patterns in your data, model them, and then visualize them. So the example that I'm going to talk about today comes within one of those packages in the modeling stream, which is called tabular, and it's all about spatial interpolation or data transfer from one geography to another one. And the best example that simple example that I have is probably this quick image where you have data. In this case, this is San Diego. This is the US Census tract, so small areas at which the census data is collected or aggregated, about 4,000 people. And you have here population counts. So you have a map of how many people were in each polygon. Sometimes this is great, but sometimes you don't want to work with census tracts because you have all of the other data you're working with in other geographies, or you have different data sets that you need to work with, and they come to you in different geographies. Some of it might be on census tracts, some of it might be on H3 hexagonal grids, some of it might be on zip codes. And to do any of your modeling, whether it's training a machine learning model or running a causal inference regression, that needs to happen all at the same geography. So what tabular does for you is provide methods and models that allow you to transfer the information encoded at this geography into a target geography, like the hexagons that you see here. So what you end up with is something that has the geographic support of the target geography, but has the information transferred as accurately or as smartly as possible, or as the method that you're using does. And I'm just going to talk about one of these methods, which is the simplest one because it's probably the easiest to understand, but also because it's used as the basis for some of the more sophisticated methods. So this is areal interpolation, where the way you go from this map here on the left to this one on the right is by apportioning population counts from each polygon to hexagonal grids that overlay or that intersect with that polygon on the basis of how much area they share. So if a polygon, say, if there happened to be a polygon that was covered 100% by a hexagon, then the target hexagon would have the exact same count. If it had, say, 50% of the polygon was covered entirely by a hexagon, then that hexagon would receive a 50% count of the original population count. And of course, those are ideal. In reality, it's a messier world, but the rationale is the same. And in terms of the computation, maybe you can start seeing here why something like dask-geopandas would be great. What happens is that we're doing an overlay like Joris was doing before. So we want to see how many hexagons every polygon is touching, and then we want to intersect them and calculate the area of those intersections so we can get those weights, and then the rest is a simple weighted average. And the weighted average can already be done in Dask, but the intersection and the overlay, which would rely on spatial indexing to make this run efficiently, right now we only support in memory, and it would be great if we, instead of, right now you pass GeoPandas geodata frame as a source for your data, and another GeoPandas geodata frame as the target, and then you get back another GeoPandas geodata frame. And it would be great to support to pass in a Dask data structure that would be able to, under the hood, do the same operations, but in an out of memory or distributed nature. And just to give you another quick example on where we're using this rationale. So I guess just to show that the range of applications that this type of operations have is quite wide, and it doesn't only have to be for, say, national data sets or smaller data sets like the census tracts. This is a project that Martin in the call as well, and Anna and I are working for at the Alan Turing Institute. We're building representations of urban form and function, so morphology of what cities look like and then what happens in those cities. And one of the things that we've done is generating our own units. So what we're doing here is tessellating space in a way that it's aligned with the theory of form and morphology and urban studies. And those are highly regular and they don't necessarily translate well into raster. So we need to have these, but they are very granular. So when you're looking at an entire country or an entire continent or a region, they easily can get to out of memory cases. So anything that we do to bring census data, to bring areal data, like things like NDVI for vegetation, or to bring other types of sources to this geography needs to happen through operations like I just described on tabular. So right now we're basically hard coding our own ad hoc algorithms, and it would be really good to have something that is much more repurposable and generic for more projects to use.
Great, thank you so much for that. So the last talk really will be about the partitioning of spatial data. So Martin's going to open up the discussion there.
Yep, thank you. Let me share my screen. Which one is going to be this? I will try to zoom out. Hope you can see everything. I will try to zoom out a bit and give a short summary of what the challenges with vector data in Dask are, focusing mostly on the partitioning part. So let me start with a quick recap how Dask chunks the data. Dask data frame chunks the data along the one dimension. So in this case, in this example, it just splits Dask data frame into pandas data frame based on time period, or you can have it just based on the order if you don't have anything specific you want to work with. Dask array chunks along two axes. So we get NumPy arrays inside, and the whole array has chunks which can be split along y and along x-axis in this easy example. But what we need to do with spatial vector data is that we have one-dimensional data structure, which is data frame, but we ideally need two-dimensional partitioning. So we need to combine the logic of the two. Why we need this? We've seen a couple of use cases before, so I think that you have pretty good idea at the moment. So just quickly fly through this. We need very efficient spatial indexing. If we know the spatial partitions before, and if those are efficiently stored, we can be much quicker when retrieving the intersections between two geometries. We need to have polygons which will be used within spatial operations within the same chunk, because to generate a union of two polygons, we need to have both in the same worker. Same happens for intersections. We also need to understand the spatial partitioning to measure spatial proximity. This is something Stefanie was talking about before. She needs to understand which GEDI points are close to her target point to generate the spatial leg and spatial weight. And again, if those are within the same chunk, it's much easier to measure spatial leg, which can be measured normally as an average of points within the certain neighborhood. If we have those in the same worker, it's easier. We don't have to do any inter-worker communication. And one thing which wasn't mentioned so far is overlapping computation. If you do overlapping computation in Dask data frame, you essentially copy specific number of rows from the data frame before your chunk and after your chunk into that chunk itself. So when you do something like rolling average, you don't have to retrieve data from other chunks, and everything is within your chunk. The same happens in Dask array, where you always get a bit of overlap of information. It's easy to do in these two cases because both are predictable. we know that I need 20 pixels or 20 rows and columns on Dask array to work with. But this is not so straightforward when we talk about vector data, because first of all, we don't even know which kind of overlap often we need. Sometimes we may work with the distance threshold. So let's assume again, Stefanie's points, we need everything within 1 kilometer. Relatively simple to say, maybe slightly expensive to actually compute. Or we can work with topological threshold. So for example, if we work with the zip codes or census tracts, as Dani showed, we may want to understand that one polygon is the direct neighbor of the another one, and we want that another one within our chunk as well. How can we achieve that? How can you achieve effective spatial partitioning? That's what I mean by that. One example which already was shown, and I shamelessly stole from spatial pandas, is the Hilbert curve. And I don't have to talk about it because it was already nicely explained. It's very smart way of automatic spatial repartitioning. In some cases, you may work with grid, more or less arbitrary. It can be just a very arbitrary grid if you want to imitate the partitioning you would do with Dask array, or you can use something like H3 geometries where the polygons have their specific size and location. But in some cases, you may want to adapt your partitioning to your actual data. So we may have to work with something like quad tree when our spatial chunks are and spatial units, the size of each chunk is very different. And in other cases, you may start from known boundaries, like local authorities in the UK. You can see on this example. So there are a lot of options, and I don't think that there is one which will fit all the use cases, but there is something. These are options we need to take into account where building support for spatial partitioning in something like dask-geopandas. So when it gets tricky, the main problem is that vector data are unpredictable. We have different geometry types. We have points, which tends to be relatively simple, but we have line strings and we have also polygons. And we don't know how long line strings are. We don't know how complex polygons are. And we also have multi-points, multi-line strings, and multi-polygons, and even geometry collections combining all three. And this brings a lot of unpredictability into chunking because they can just cross the whole area, as you will see in a second. We don't know how they are spatially distributed. So for example, the polygons on the left-hand side in here, we can imagine that we will fit the Hilbert curve into this area and will nicely give us our spatial chunks. That would work. While on the right-hand side, it would work as well, but there are slight issues with polygons which are just going through the whole area. So we can chunk them in to one chunk, and we know that if we do based on centroids, as the spatial pandas implementation does, we may find an issue that our spatial index then will not be as efficient as we need it. Or we can work with some very complex line strings, which don't allow us actually to do any meaningful spatial partitioning. One other aspect which needs to be taken account, which is not necessarily linked to spatial partitioning, but to partitioning per se, is the unknown complexity of geometries. Normally, when we work with Dask data frames, we know that if we have a column of floats, every observation there is a float, and everything is essentially the same thing. When we work with vector geometries, we don't know this. We may have a simple point or a simple polygon in one row and super complex fractal geometry in other one. And when we try to do something like shape indices to fit the smallest circle around our polygon, or the largest one drawn inside the polygon, or something like this, the geometry on the very right will be much more expensive than the one on the left. So in some cases, we may want to take into account complexity of polygons when we do the spatial partitioning. So all our workers will finish the task at approximately the same time. And the final tricky bit is unpredictable spatial distribution of our observations. This is the example from the quad reaction before. We can't assume in most cases that all our points, polygons, line strings are distributed across the area uniformly. More often they are not. And spatial repartitioning should take into account such distribution, so we have approximately the same number of observations within each partition. So what would be nice to have in dask-geopandas or spatial pandas or any other vector-based Dask implementation? Well, we already found out that we need efficient spatial indexing. I think that that's something almost every vector-based analysis will heavily benefit from. We need support for overlapping computation if we want to avoid expensive cross-worker communication. And maybe we want to take into account the memory demands of different rows. So for the next almost, let's say 50 minutes, almost an hour, we would like to have a discussion regarding essentially the one questions: how to create smart spatial partitions, which will take into account all these challenges we have with vector data, and how to efficiently store them so our spatial indexing is fast and we don't lose any information on the way. And that's all from me. And I think that we can now get few questions for all the presentations and then come back to the discussion and have a discussion during the remaining time, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, so are there any remaining questions about any of the presentations?
I actually do have one for Anita. I'm curious whether we should consider trajectory data more as point data, because that's essentially a point with a timestamp, or as line string data going through the whole area.
Yeah, I don't think there's a simple answer for that. It really depends so much on what kind of analysis you want to run on it, whether it's more convenient to consider it a point or a line. It's a really tricky question, and I don't think we can have one universal answer. And I think for reusability purposes, it probably makes more sense to deal with the generic, just the geometry with timestamp first. Because if you really want to do something that specializes in movement data, you would also want to think of different indices, I think, than just the regular space filling curves that are currently implemented, for example, in GeoMesa and GeoWave, which can take into account timestamp, but also don't know anything about the intricacies, or they cannot leverage the additional information that the points are actually part of the chain of locations of the same object. That would just make everything much more complicated. And I think for the general purpose libraries, it just makes sense to do the normal spatial temporal event type of data first.
I have a follow-up question on that. When I was I understood your presentation that you basically have, so ideally you want spatial partitioning, but also time partitioning, so that that are close together in time are and close together in space, so both in both close together in a single partition. But so in theory, the dask-geopandas, or in general Dask data frame, so we could store spatial partitions, and there is also still an index which can be the time in theory. So I was thinking, in principle, I mean, it could support it, of course. You need to create it and you need to make use of it, the information, but purely like we can store a spatial partition and a time-based index. But the question that I actually had was, you also want that the points of the same trajectory are together. So that's actually a third element that you need to take into account for when partitioning.
Yeah, for most of the analysis, you will want all the points of one moving object together. Because usually you need to operate on them sequentially. So that's also why it's so convenient to store them in a line representation, because then they are automatically together. And that's also why the implementation in Moving Pandas currently is that I have this one geodata frame which has a temporal index, and it contains all the points, the timestamp points, and there's a convenience function which turns the point geodata frame in a line string data frame for visualization purposes and for analysis purposes, where you might be interested in the segment information between consecutive points. So it constantly switches between the point representation and the line representation for different use cases. And also because Moving Pandas is so much about exploration and not about one specific question that it wants to answer very efficiently, it's very hard to give definitive answers because every user will want something slightly different from it. But in any case, particularly for the visualizations, I think it will be useful to have faster ways of looking at large data sets than we have right now.
Can I ask a question about the Datashader?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, so first of all, I'd like to thank all the presenters for their interesting talks. I really learned a couple of things. I also like seeing PyGeos called a lot of times in the chat. Joris and I have been working on it the last 2 years. And so if there's anything, please shout out if you have troubles with PyGeos. But my question about spatial pandas is, so I work in Dask also a bit with partitioning, and the problem I encountered a lot is that the number of partitions tends to get out of hand very fast if you don't do a smart partitioning, and then your overhead of Dask gets way too large. Is there anything you do in spatial pandas to counter that effect, or did you get this issue?
So there's nothing, I mean, I guess like when you're performing the spatial packing, like the number of partitions is a configuration that you pass in. So there's not anything being optimized, but also isn't like it's not increasing kind of past what you tell it to. Because when you get number of partitions to the normal Dask like set index operation, and it uses the equal size partition approach, like you're not passing in the boundaries, so you're telling it to take the sort this column and make 50 partitions of the same size, and asking Dask to do that part. Is that in the realm of your question?
Yes, so you set the number of partition as opposed to the size of the partition. Yeah, okay. I think that also in the consideration of that Martin presented, I think that's also maybe something important to keep in mind, that if you just set the size of a partition and you have a very big data set, then you get into trouble. While you sometimes need a small partition size because points are really close together. Spatially.
Yeah, that certainly is a delicate thing to choose. That is an important thing to set, how smaller partitions end up being. And the workflow, like whether you're planning to only look at a couple of things at a time, if your workflow is to just pick out the nearest couple of points to a location, then you do want small partitions. But if your workflow is more like, I'm generally going to be looking at a third of everything, then you don't want your partitions to be so small. So that does end up being an important tuning piece.
Yeah, so it really depends on your use case, of course. Yeah, thanks.
Are there any more questions about the presentations, or do you want to just keep going with the conversation about spatial partitioning? Anita brought up in the chat that it might be interesting to look into the GeoMess code, that they have a different way of indexing non-point geometries. Do you want to say more about that, or do you just want to like drop that there for us to think about in the future?
I just wanted to drop it there. I don't remember the details anymore. Would have to look up some recording of their presentations, because unfortunately the slides don't provide much context, but they've certainly been thinking about how to deal with polygons as well. And they do use space filling curves, even though not the Hilbert curve, they use this set-shaped one, but that shouldn't make a difference.
Cool.
I have a discussion topic to propose, if that's okay.
Sure.
It's basically just an observation that Datashader as a project, we went forward with, we need to render these things and there's no efficient thing we can do. We're just going to do it. And that's how Spatial Pandas developed. But it's appropriate at this point to take a step back and really think about, why should Spatial Pandas have its own spatial indexing algorithm that can't be used by anybody else, and other aspects like that. Ideally, we'd get to a place where instead of having separate vertical integrations of sets of functionality that are independent from each other, we would have horizontal mix and match, so that if you need spatial indexing, you can write spatial indexing once and use it in GeoPandas, use it in using it on arrays of PyGeos objects, arrays of Shapely objects, arrays of other things, and so that we could have a little bit more coalescing around improving spatial indexing in general, and then applying that across libraries, as opposed to each one independently making small steps. Anyway, I'm just throwing that out there. That's a personal goal of mine. We have no wish in our projects to be responsible for a vertical slice. We just went in there and did it in order that there be one example that top to bottom is fully efficient all the way down and doesn't depend on libraries like GDAL and Fiona that are external to, that are specific to the geographic ecosystem. In our case, we need things that are just general purpose Python data munging. As long as we want a fast, efficient stack that does that, and we don't care whose stack it is, we just want there to be one. So we made there be one, and we're ready to step back. If somebody can figure out how to implement spatial indexing in a way that cuts across libraries, that'll work with geo-specific objects and non-geo-specific objects, that's great. We'd love for that to happen. We don't know how to make that happen here at Anaconda. Or, well, I'm not currently making that happen, let's just say.
I think an important aspect of this is representation of geometries. Points are simple, of course, but lines, polygons, split polygons, because that was essentially the problem for for spatial pandas or for Datashader using GeoPandas. I think in this area, with the work that we are doing with PyGeos, we'll make it a lot easier to efficiently convert from one format to the other. So for now, GeoPandas uses geos under the hood. It's a simple dependency, but it's still a C++ object that holds the geometry. But it's relatively efficient to get all the coordinates out of those objects and create an array of coordinates with appropriate in indices or offsets to create the ragged array representation that spatial pandas and Datashader uses at the moment. So I think one aspect, I mean, there are of course a lot more aspects to it, but I think one aspect is ensuring that, yeah, there is a bit more standardization around those different formats, and that, for example, a library like Datashader that wants it in one format, that it can easily recognize another data that is in another format. But if there is an easy recognition and conversion between those two formats, that can already help a lot in integrating different libraries.
I think it's also worth mentioning the effort of Joris to merge Shapely and PyGeos. That's at least one library less.
Yes, thank you, Joris.
Slowly, but sometime we're getting there.
And just for a little bit of history, this all of this work, or a good bit of everything we're discussing here, traces back to some funding that we had from NASA, where I made things worse by giving some money to Joris to work on PyGeos and that sort of thing, and money to Jon to work on spatial pandas. And the idea was to try to make things move along their trajectories in place. But now we need more money to move them together. Now that PyGeos exists, it's possible that there don't have to be these two independent streams. Before, there were very independent streams, arrays of Shapely Python objects and arrays of raw numeric data that we could really crunch on. And those were completely separate initiatives. And we moved both of them forward, but we did not bring them together. We ran out of money before bringing them together, money and time.
Bednar,
sorry, just to answer very concrete. Yeah. So I opened an issue in Datashader. I posted in the comment. You can, if you're interested in the discussion, you can already subscribe to it. It's empty, but I will fill it in with a bit of context on how this conversion can happen with the latest version of PyGeos, and how we can, yeah, find out a way that libraries can communicate well.
So we have a couple different conversations happening in the chat. So Bednar brought up the idea of a general spatial indexing library that can be used across different packages, and that would be interesting in the X-ray context as well. Do you want to say more about that?
Please.
Yeah, sure. So can you hear me? Good.
Yep.
Yeah, we've been doing some experiments on the X-ray side with some spatial indexing and geographical indexing using different libraries like S2 geometry, for example. And yeah, it was actually a good outcome. And I think that I've been also looking at different solutions. I've found a while ago this spatial pandas too, and was interested by this Hilbert curve and spatial indexing. Something that we could reuse also in X-ray, where we try to bring some flexible indexes to be able to index also multi-dimensional arrays with some geographic information. So yeah, that would be something, maybe joining forces and libraries that could be reused across GeoPandas and X-ray would be nice. What would be nice too is being able, here we've been talking about some data with a time dimension. So there's some time index, spatial index for points, but points, lines also. So maybe they could be a third dimension, which is actually the category of the points and so on. So I think this kind of data from the moving pandas project could be represented with GeoPandas, but also maybe X-ray. And what would be nice in the future is to have more seamless conversion between GeoPanda data frame and X-ray with some custom geographic indexes and so on. So yeah, that would be nice.
Definitely.
I'm just
Maybe Martin, go ahead.
Yeah, I want to say just a bit of context regarding spatial indexing in GeoPandas itself. For a long time, we were relying on R3, which is based on C libraries lib spatial index. With PyGeos, we are now having another implementation of spatial indexing using PyGeos str3. And we had a discussion before to make an open API for plugging in any other potential implementations. So this may be a good opportunity to actually do it finally, to move the spatial indexing bits and functions to a separate library, which can be plugged into both X-ray and GeoPandas.
Maybe if I can jump in here, we've also recently been having conversations about bringing QGIS closer to the pandas ecosystem, and how we could make seamless conversions between QGIS layers, which are C++ objects, and get them into data frames or geodata frames. Do you have any thoughts? What would be probably the most efficient workflow for that? How could we convert from the one representation to the other?
So in that case, are you talking about getting data out of QGIS or running things inside of QGIS that make use of the larger Python ecosystem and kind of bring it into QGIS as an end user GUI functionality?
The big vision would be, for example, to have a Jupyter notebook running inside of QGIS where you can interact with the layers through all the Python libraries that you fancy.
I see. Cool. That'd be fun.
I'm personally not familiar with how QGIS stores the data and what APIs they provide to access them. But yeah, in principle, if they have APIs to access the data in some form, you should always be able to, on the fly, construct a geodata frame viewing the same data. But yeah, I'm not sure how that would work in practice.
Okay. I think the current idea is to go via NumPy and to generate the data frames from there, at least for the non-spatial part. But we'll give it a go, and if you're interested, I can report back.
Hey,
Yeah, certainly.
so sorry to jump in here. Also, just a quick comment. I've also heard something along those lines, and QGIS has its own C++ representation of geometry. So, and I think I heard it in a different context, but they're also not immediately, like GEDI. Yeah, I think between GEDI and QGIS, they have also different geometry representations. And I think from the GEDI side, they were also discussing if it would make sense to have one C++ geometry representation for QGIS and GEDI. Just to bring this also in here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there are at least two competing ones which also have different requirements, and that's why you get all kinds of validity checks which sometimes fail for QGIS, but they work in GEOS, and then random failures in analysis tools. That's horrible.
Computer side.
I maybe want to come back to the some of the spatial partitioning questions that Martin ended his talk with. So the two questions that you asked, Martin, were I think how to construct and how to store. But I'm wondering to what extent the two need to be tied, or like, for example, if you construct the partitions, or you identify the partitions using a quad tree, should the stored spatial partitioning information, should that still know that it came from a quad tree, or can I just store the spatial extents? That's a bit I'm wondering. Is it clear, my question?
Yeah.
Or?
Well, I think that both approaches are actually possible. We can make it relatively, let's say simple and have the same spatial storage of partitioning as we have at the moment in dask-geopandas. So you essentially get a convex hull around it. But since quad tree itself is used for spatial indexing, it may be actually worth keeping this information in when we, for example, want to get the overlapping computation information. So we don't have to again re-index everything based on the convex hull, but you know which cells of quad tree are neighboring which others.
One of the reasons that I'm asking is also I can assume that once you want to preserve spatial partitioning information in some operations that might do some transformation, that will become hard to keep that preserved if it's not a very simple bounding box or polygon information for your spatial extent. Like if you do coordinate transformation, in principle you could also just transform your extents, or if you do a buffer operation similar. While if you store something like the quad tree, I suppose you can't really do that. Or
yeah, I think that with transformation of geometries, it will always be tricky to preserve the spatial partitioning, because buffer may be easy if you buffer everything with a similar attribute, but if you are shifting geometries across depending on some of their attributes, you may just break the spatial partitioning very quickly. So in that case, it may be, I don't know what is the best way, whether to try to find a way which will make spatial repartitioning super lightweight and quick to do, or whether you should take into account that you will break it at some point and slightly change your workflows or something. Because I believe that this is expensive. In most cases, this will be the really expensive bit to actually reshuffle everything and to figure out how to reshuffle it even more.
Yeah, it's true that if your data is already partitioned, it's much cheaper to infer the extents. I mean, to get to know the extents if they are already nicely partitioned than the actual original repartition. Maybe a question for Jon. How does spatial pandas currently store the information? Is it just the extents, or also an actual index?
So like in the Parquet representation, like on disk, is that what you're thinking? So the partition data, the bounding boxes are boxes, they're not convex holes. And when writing to Parquet, the partition level bounding boxes get stored into the, I forget the name, the top level cross partition metadata file in there. And so that's not like the actual artery, that's just the bounding boxes for the partitions. And then on load, it builds up an artery. And we're talking about like hundreds of thousands of partitions. That's really, really fast to do. So there's not really any real cost to build like an artery from a few hundred or thousand bounding boxes. So for that purpose, it seemed like it was fine just to recompute it rather than trying to store the hierarchical data representation in the file somehow.
And it also stores, it has the index, right? It has the position along the Hilbert curve is stored in the Parquet file.
Yeah, I think the index itself is stored there. That doesn't get used at all for spatial indexing after the packing. Like it's just the bounding boxes that get computed from those partitions that get used for the spatial indexing itself. So it doesn't really get, I think it's in there, but it doesn't really get used during the actual like lookup process.
Right.
Have you found some really tricky corner cases while working with Hilbert curve?
We didn't really get into any coordinate system transformation things, so it was always done in the same coordinate frame. So yeah, that would be, yeah, and that would definitely change your ordering if you did a coordinate transformation. So.
Yeah. Those are very expensive.
Yeah, that is tough. Yeah, I think you in general would have to have the indexing for a coordinate space. I don't really see how you'd be able to transform after indexing in a general way.
Right. So we assume that's done by the time Datashader sees anything. No projection transformations after that.
I've been thinking more about Anita's case of like having 4 different dimensions basically for the index and partition along. I'm wondering if it would ever make sense to just store the data multiple times, partition in different ways. Does anyone know if, is that a weird, is that too weird?
Oh, it's very expensive. Anita, you're muted if you're responding.
Yeah, that was my same thought. It's very expensive. Obviously, the distributed solutions, they already do store the same data multiple times for performance reasons, but they still store it with the same indexing on the multiple locations. Obviously, it would be possible, but I think might be really hard also to keep track of all the different representations if you change something in the data.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I've just been trying to find, because PostGIS also recently added space filling curves, and I've been trying to find if they have been dealing with polygons and lines, but so far I haven't found anything, just points.
Yeah, I really like the idea of space filling curve, but at the same time, I'm really cautious about it when it comes to lines and polygons, because to do it, you have to represent your geometry as a centroid. And in some cases, that's very suboptimal, I would say.
Yeah. Particularly overlapping polygons. I don't know what's supposed to happen there. Because for something like US states, representing as a centroid is not bad. But for other polygons that don't have that property of being disjoint like that and spatially compact.
What kind of representations would be better tailored for handling that? Like, is there another way to do it where you're not looking at like convex bounding regions or
boxes? I don't know.
I mean, I guess like let's back things back. Like if you're using, like, this question about like whether you're using an artery at all. Like if you're using an artery at all, then I mean there's lots of ways to decide how to build the initial artery, but then your lookup can all work exactly the same way. And the space filling curve is just one way to build up the artery. So I guess the question is, like, is there a better way to build up an R tree for handling like non polygons that are not nicely compact, or is it like, or is an R tree just not well suited to handle that at all, and we need to look at other kinds of data structures?
I would say that if you have these kind of complex polygons, then R3 is not the optimal index because all your bounding boxes will be overlapping and it won't help you much in the end. But I don't know what the better option is actually.
Anyway, it seems like first step, if we can get spatial indexing to work across libraries, then we can have a gradual stream of better and better spatial indexing. That would be great. But if right now, if that's proceeding in so many different parallel tracks, we'll never get very far on spatial indexing.
Related to that,
yeah, go ahead.
There was, I think there was some interest in moving out the Hilbert curve implementation from spatial pandas. I saw someone comment about that, or
I want everything to move out of spatial pandas because I don't want to have to maintain spatial pandas. I want it to all disappear into the libraries where it makes the most sense and I can use it there rather than have it be a separate library. But for the moment it is for various reasons of dependencies and speed.
Code-wise, and the Hilbert curve implementation and the R tree implementation are totally separate. Like those would be very easy to separate out from the rest if someone wanted to. They're pretty well commented. There aren't any specific docs for them, so it would just be a matter of someone wanted to copy those files out and play with them and see if they thought it was worth separating them and either rolling them into some other library or making them their own separate package. But there wouldn't be any refactoring needed to do that. So that's the point.
I can't really find any good examples from GeoMease right now, but I think they are not just using the centroid of the polygon, but they're breaking down the polygon into those different areas along the grid so that you can assign it to different parts of the index, I think. So you will hit the polygon in multiple places. But I have yet to find a good explanation of how they do it. I know they have some scientific papers on it, which they published around 2014. So maybe it might be worth digging into that or just getting in touch with the developers directly. But it's certainly not just based on the centroid of the polygon.
If I read it correctly, this may help in the actual spatial indexing, but it doesn't really help with spatial repartitioning when we want to understand where the single polygon needs to be placed, right?
If you put it only in one place, yeah, that's true. That's true, it's an indexing solution.
I've been actually digging a little bit in the S2 geometry code because I wanted to just reuse that library for a simple point index. And there's no extensive documentation. I couldn't find it, but just looking into the code, there is actually a lot of building blocks that I think could be reused for spatial indexing, but also maybe spatial partitioning. And there is a lot of the different kinds of objects, points, region, polygons, and so on, that could be reused for higher level operations. But yeah, unfortunately, there's not much examples, and also I'm not sure that the library is very actively maintained. I think it's already featureful, but there's not much activity on the repository.
I know that there is, in the R spatial community, is quite some activity recently to interface and wrap around with S2. Maybe they also have better documentation and examples than S2 itself. I don't know. But I'm also not aware of like active, or for example, active Python interface.
No, I think that last time when we were looking into that, we sort of came to a conclusion that if we wanted to use S2 in a similar way we use Geos, we would have to write something like PyGeos for S2.
Unless there are other questions, I might want to ask a question about a different topic. I mean, related to this, of course, but I/O, something we didn't talk that much about. We had some examples. I showed Parquet, and that's also a format that in Spatial Pandas is well supported, and so also supported in Dask GeoPandas. It's actually the main I/O format that's, I think, currently supported in one of those libraries. Except if you use, I mean, you can always use a generic Dask read function, and then as one of your first steps, convert it to a geodata frame. But direct geospatial loader, I think Parquet is the main one that currently exists. And so some other options. So the typical geospatial formats, shapefile, geopackage, those kind of things. They might also not necessarily be well suited for big data, but still there exist big geopackage files, for example, that you might want to read. So one option is with Fiona through GEDI, but the only you only would be able to use that in multiprocessing, and it's also not very fast to start with. Brendan Ward has been working on PyOgrio as a Cython-based vectorized interface to GEDI, which is a lot faster. And there might be an option to maybe release the GIL in there, so it could be used in a multi-threaded fashion, but that's also not currently implemented. Maybe that for specific formats like GeoPackage, there might also be pure Python versions that could be leveraged for a lighter weight interface. So that's for like the traditional file formats. I can imagine that something like PostGIS is also an interesting format. But so yeah, I wanted to hear a bit like, what formats do you think would be you would want to use or think would be important for Dask GeoPandas to support?
For me, definitely PostGIS would be a big and shapefile as well. I'm missing the vectorized versions of these. Of course, so Brandon has this PyOgrio. That would be great if that would be expanded upon.
Yeah, for PyOgrio, we are planning to integrate it better in GeoPandas, more directly the coming months. And if that's the case, it should be relatively easy to do it in Dask GeoPandas as well, but it would still be with multiprocessing and not multi-threading. But
yeah, I agree that PostGIS and other SQL databases are probably the important aspect where to load data from, because, for example, by that project Dani showed during his presentation, when we were working with quite granular data for the whole Great Britain, we store the input data as a PostGIS database. Once we start working with GeoPandas and Dask GeoPandas, we move everything to Parquet files, but the initial database is PostGIS. And I assume that this will be the case for a lot of people. That's how large datasets are usually stored. It's some kind of database. It may not be PostGIS, it may be MongoDB or something like that. But having efficient interface with that, at least for reading, but ideally for writing as well with Dask GeoPandas, is probably more important than with normal GeoPandas, I would say.
Also, GeoJSON would be for web applications, so great addition.
Yeah, GeoPandas currently normally reads GeoJSON via Fiona via GDAL, but it's not necessary. So it may be worth having implementation, pure Python implementation for Dask GeoPandas, which would be much easier to scale.
Mhm.
Yeah, there are actually, I mean, for example, pandas use an efficient JSON reader, which is much faster than going through GDAL. And once you have have it as a read JSON, you can always convert your geometries yourself. Specifically for PostGIS, are there? I think the main problem is that what I'm wondering about is like, how can you efficiently get data out of PostGIS? Like, would it be useful to make use of like that you can do a spatial query directly or
I don't know exactly how to do it efficiently, but I believe that if we can read data from PostGIS, which would directly fit into spatial partitions, into efficient spatial partitions, that would be the optimal way. So you don't have to do repartitioning within Dask GeoPandas. But I think it probably a lot of depends also on the hardware you have, whether you have your database on a fast machine or not, or it may be actually more efficient to load it as it is and then do the repartitioning on Dask cluster if you have it already prepared.
One approach we took is just make tiles without knowing where the vectors are, and make a Dask entry into Dask graph for every tile, and then just send the PostGIS query for every tile when needed. That's a very efficient approach if the vectors are distributed across like sort of evenly.
Yeah, that seems like a good approach. I think we should probably wrap up so people have time to take a break before the next session, unless there's any last minute things that people need to say.
Just thanks to Julia and Martin and Joris for organizing it. Certainly sparked a lot of ideas and interest.
Cool. Thank you to all of you for showing up. There's a Slack channel. I've been dropping sort of like random comments from the chat into there. I think the Zoom chat will go away. So if anyone, you can carry on conversing in there, or I think that'll be a forever place where we can talk about this stuff. So that would be good. There's also a couple issues that Joris has been linking. And yeah, thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks all.
Thanks all.
Yep.
Bye.